Hi, everybody. Welcome back from our short fall break. I know you had work to do last week, so it wasn't a huge break, although you didn't have readings. Hopefully, you used the time to catch up on your book reading so that you could write your update for your scholarly book review on the day I'm recording this, which happens to be Tuesday. I obviously haven't turned in your assignments yet, so um, I'm sure that the assignments are going to be great. This week, though, week 10, what I want to talk about is really something that relates to the readings that you're assigned. So you notice that I gave you a lot of works by Gulick, Luther Gulick, who is famous in the Administrative Management School of Public Administration, as it's called. Luther Gulick served on a committee called the Brownlow Committee. And so I have you read part of the Brownlow Committee report. And that was in the 1930s during the presidency of Franklin D. Roosevelt. And then I have you read an article published by the Congressional Research Service more recently that actually talks about the executive office of the president. And so what's that have to do with everything we've been covering so far? Well, the idea is that what happened during the FDR administration is that the executive was greatly strengthened. It was not by accident, and it was not by happenstance. Uh, it happened really with the concurrence of Congress, and for a lot of reasons, that era of presidential politics happens to be a touchstone for us as the executive was greatly strengthened. So what I want to talk about with this lecture is something that will supplement what you're reading, and that is this idea that there's tension built into our constitutional framework, and we want to talk about how that tension has continued to manifest itself as we move along through history. So first of all, Luther Gulick. So Luther Gulick wrote about the theory of administration. As I said, he was one of the leaders of what is called the Administrative Management School of Public Administration. Um, Luther came up with this acronym called POSDCORB, which we've probably touched on before. I'm going to touch on it again later on here. But Luther believed very much in an organized bureaucracy. He felt that in any executive agency, there should be division of labor by skill and task. He believed in functional departments by task group, for example, the typing department. And he believed that there were limits on the division of labor. So, in other words, you could actually divide labor too much. You could end up sub-optimizing by subdividing one full-time task. You could divide labor where technology and custom define the task of the worker. Anyway, you could do physical subdivision, but you shouldn't do organic subdivision. So what he meant by that was that you can subdivide workers physically, but you really shouldn't subdivide them if you're actually subdividing the synergy that they have together. Um, but through all that division of labor, I should say, he really strongly believed in coordination of effort. So coordination is required because division of labor does, by itself, create confusion and poor communication. And so again here, Gulick's answer was proper organization. Let's move into a little more of what Gulick was talking about. So what Gulick believed was that an ideal organization should establish a system of authority. That is, there's a single directing authority, but there are other authorities below that directing authority. So that single directing authority defines the task to be done, appoints a director, determines how to subdivide tasks, and establishes the structure of authority between the director and the workers to enable coordination. So what does all that mean? What all that means is before anyone even issues the check to the client, for example, the organization is completely set up and thought through. And so the administrative management school of thought really believed that what mattered most was the way you organized. So span of control is very important in this organization. There isn't a magic number, and it varies by the work. But really, as you read this slide, think of this. Some of the ideas we get to are things like, an ideal span of control is 3 to 6 workers per supervisor. And we still use these kinds of rules of thumb in organizations that we're part of. Unity of command is essential in organizations. That is, that outside organizations will coordinate with you, but they will not command you. And that executives and directors are specialized in functional areas. And so Gulick came up with this idea of POSDCORB to really say what executives were supposed to do. So POSDCORB stands for planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. So the idea is, if the question is, what does an executive do? This is what an executive does. These tasks under POSDCORB: planning, organizing, staffing, directing, coordinating, reporting, and budgeting. So no matter what your particular bureaucracy happens to be, you're going to be involved in these activities, and every executive will be involved in these activities. And so take a minute, you might put this on pause or whatever, to look at those and understand what Gulick's talking about, because it's going to relate to his later work having to do with the executive office of the president. Gulick, one of his strongest emphases was the enhancement of executive power, both within a particular organization and among the organizations of the executive branch. That is, the executive branch of the President of the United States. Gulick said, neither the public nor the legislature is capable of the planning needed by effective government. So if the goal is effective government, Gulick's idea is that the executive, that is, the President, plans for what should logically happen in government. In other words, the executive is in charge of strategic planning. So where does that leave the legislature? Where that leaves the legislature is actually as a veto point. It's up to the legislature to see what the president's plans are and really and truly second guess the president. Not all the time, but perhaps second guess and adjust what the executive says. And so this idea for Gulick is that the ideal government is one in which the chief executive, supported by special staffs, draws the plans, the legislature accepts or rejects proposed policies. And so Gulick became part of a special commission that was formed in the Roosevelt administration called the Brownlow Committee. Consisted of Louis Brownlow, Charles Merriam, and Luther Gulick, to make recommendations for how the presidency should be organized. And so remember, this is in the 1930s. The country is already 150 years old, but now Gulick and his cohorts are reorganizing the executive. So here's what Gulick said about executive power, and he's talking about executive power in government, that the government does play a positive role in society, especially acting in the case of market failure. But there should be public-private partnership, basically. He says that the executive branch at all levels of government, and that would be at the state level as well, and even at the city level, proposes and implements policies, while the legislature should be limited to approval or rejection of executive proposals. He believed that the chief executive office should be strengthened through improved staff support. So basically what Gulick is saying is that the sparse presidency envisioned in the Constitution was really no longer useful. He believed that better collaboration between levels of government should be strived for. That is, the legislature and the executive should cooperate and collaborate more than they fight with each other. He believed that administrators are necessary and they are involved in political and policy matters. They are necessarily involved in those matters. And so this idea that there's a politics administrative dichotomy, really, Gulick adjusts that. He doesn't believe that that's really the case. He says scientific methods should be employed to understand general principles of administration. So you remember scientific management from Taylor, and that top leaders in executive branch organizations should coordinate and integrate activities to achieve unity of purpose. So you can really see how Gulick really is borrowing from Weber and from Taylor to form his thinking on how the executive branch should operate. So there was this committee called the Brownlow Committee, which I talked about the members of the Brownlow Committee a couple of slides ago. Go down to the very last bullet there. It says that an act enabled FDR to submit reorganization plans, the most significant of which was the Executive Office of the President under what was called Reorganization Plan Number 1. So I'll go back to the top of the slide where I say Brownlow and the Reorganization Act of 1939. The Brownlow Committee proposed all of these things, that the White House staff had to be expanded, that the managerial agencies in the executive department, particularly those that dealt with things like budget and personnel, should be strengthened, that the merit system, that is the civil service system, should be extended in the executive office of the president so that the best talent could work in government service, and that the entire executive branch of government should be overhauled and reduced to a few large departments. Okay, here's how the Brownlow Committee and the Reorganization Act of 1939 connect with each other. The Brownlow Committee issued its report to Congress. Congress passed the Reorganization Act of 1939. There is a bit of a misunderstanding about what happened in 1939. Yes, it is very true that the power and the scope of the presidency under the 4 administrations of Franklin Roosevelt did expand. What's not true is that Roosevelt somehow did this in an underhanded way, in a way that undercut the power of Congress. Congress was in on the action. Congress passed an act to reorganize the White House as a branch of government. So what does that say? Well, what it says really is that Congress here in 1939, 150 years after the founding of the country and the Constitution, was basically saying the small presidency is no longer adequate. And Congress said the executive needs to do at least some of the things that Gulick said the executive should be doing. That is, being the leading branch in government, if you will. That doesn't mean that the tension between the legislative branch and the executive branch ended there, because it certainly didn't, as we're going to go forward and see in the next few slides. So this is the executive office of the president approximately currently. And if you look at that, that document that I asked you to read from the Congressional Research Service, it talks about some of these agencies. But what I want you to look at is all the various things that are part of the executive office of the president. And also look at the offices that require confirmation by the Senate and the ones that don't require confirmation by the Senate. Of course, the second line down, and maybe I should have that first, is the office of the vice president. There's a large office of the vice president with some of the same kinds of officers serving in the vice president's staff. But look who requires confirmation and who doesn't. Of course, the chief of staff to the president doesn't require Senate confirmation, although arguably some chiefs of staff have been the second most powerful person in government, really, more powerful than the vice president in many cases. Look at the ones who do require confirmation. The Office of Management and Budget. Who is the really the budget coordination office for the executive branch. That requires confirmation. The Office of the United States Trade Representative requires confirmation. There are offices that don't require confirmation, and you can see those there. And you could probably notice that some of those offices might not directly affect policy, but they might. And so what's really important, though, to notice is that the executive office of the president is a large branch of government. It's not a few people acting as personal advisors to the president. It's a very large branch of government doing a lot of policy work. So what's that conflict with? Well, really what it conflicts with is kind of this constitutional view of Congress and of the president. This is, we've talked about this, this is the constitutional view of Congress. If all you read is the Constitution, this is what you know about Congress. The vice president is a non-voting member of the Senate. The vice president is simultaneously a member of the Senate and the executive. John Adams, the first vice president, didn't happen to like sitting in the Senate chamber, and so he didn't do it very often. The question is, what would have happened precedent-wise if John Adams had decided that that was the most important job in government and decided to become something like the president of the Senate, which is what that position is, and speak on behalf of the Senate to the president? What would have become of the relationship between the Senate and the president? It might have been totally different. So the constitutional view of Congress is that the Senate was selected, not elected, by state legislatures. Only one branch was elected by the people, and the franchise itself was very limited. However, really, that was the only branch of the national government that was elected, the House of Representatives. And so the Congress had the power to tax, the power to borrow, the power to coin money, the power to declare war, the power to fund the military, but only on 2-year appropriations, the power to establish the laws that govern the military, and the power to make laws that are necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. That is, of the whole Constitution. So the necessary and proper clause actually has been the hanger for all kinds of acts of Congress over the past 240 years. So that's the constitutional view of Congress. This is the constitutional view of the presidency, and this is the view that really was taken to task by the Brownlow Committee and the Reorganization Act of 1939. Executive power was vested in a president of the United States. The president was indirectly elected, chosen by states with state discretion on method. The president was the commander-in-chief of the Army and the Navy and the militia. And the part that everybody forgets about was what the Constitution says was when called into actual service of the United States. And my argument is that the way the Constitution is written, the military belonged to the Congress. The Congress made the laws for the military. The president did become the commander-in-chief when called into actual service of the United States. That changed. It didn't just change in the last 50 or 70 years. It changed over time. But you know that quite often in the media, the president is referred to as the commander-in-chief. My opinion, again, is that's really a misappropriation of the term. That wasn't a term that you would have heard the founders using to describe the president, unless we were fighting a war. And yes, the president does have power to make treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. The president does have the power to appoint officers with the advice and consent of the Senate. The president, from time to time, must give Congress information on the State of the Union, which is an interesting wording from time to time. And most early presidents did that by writing a letter. There wasn't the State of the Union address as we know it now, the pageantry. There wasn't any of that. It was a letter from the president to the Congress. Unbelievably, the president has the power to convene and adjourn Congress. It's never been used. there is no requirement in the Constitution for the president to submit an executive budget. Prior to 1920, each department submitted a budget to the Congress without necessarily coordination from the president. There is no ability of the president to declare war unilaterally without the Congress. And this is the constitutional view of the presidency. And so we've read this, and so this is just a review, but Federalist 51 said that ambition must be made to counteract ambition. What were Hamilton and Madison talking about there? Well, they were talking about the relationship between the executive and the legislative, and between the central government and the states. So in a republic, the legislative authority necessarily predominates. This is what was said in the Federalist Papers. That is, the executive was seen as a weak branch, having only a veto power. The question is that still true? So the government was to be federal, though this certainly means more than 3 levels of government, because it was interlocking. So again, in the Constitution, the Senate represented the states, not the people. So if you can separate the interests of the people in the states against the interest of the state itself, that's what the Senate was about. And so there's an argument that actually I make, that when the amendment was passed to allow direct election of senators, that probably could have been the time when the abolition of the Electoral College could be considered. Why do I say that? I say that because the election of the president really was, in the Constitution, something of a contest of preference between the states themselves, not the people at large, but between the states themselves. So I kind of want to switch gears here and talk about how the presidency really has become, over time, the stronger branch of the 3 branches of government. And I think a lot of people have that opinion. So, I have this proposition, arguably, that those whom we remember as famous presidents, we've had 45 now, became that way because, for one thing, they expanded the power of the presidency vis-a-vis Congress. Would permanent legislative dominance have resulted with a less revered first president? If George Washington had not been the first president, would the legislature actually grow to dominate the government, and would it have stayed that way? The 1800 election of Jefferson, with his so-called running mate Aaron Burr, resulted in the 12th Amendment. The 12th Amendment, if you go and read it, and you should, is the amendment that basically sets up the idea that when we have elections for president, parties really will submit a candidate for president and a candidate for vice president. That's because the election of 1800 resulted in a tie in the Electoral College between Jefferson and not his opponent for the presidency, but his vice presidential candidate, Aaron Burr. And Burr did not concede. And so I think there were something like 35 different ballots in the House of Representatives to finally elect Thomas Jefferson as president. The 12th Amendment was passed quickly after that. Jefferson, and we've studied the Jeffersonian idea versus the Hamiltonian idea. Jefferson, without the consultation of Senate, purchased Louisiana from France, effectively doubling the size of the United States. He did that without the consultation of Congress. It was a very Hamiltonian act. Jackson, without a law, forced the deportation of the Cherokee and other native nations from their native lands. So the Cherokee and other nations were marched to what became Oklahoma later on what is known as the Trail of Tears. Jackson is credited with the spoils system, which really enhanced the power of the president in hiring. Lincoln, arguably our favorite president in the eyes of many, he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which means basically you can hold people without trial. And and he effectively kept Maryland a slave state and other border states in the Union through martial law. Maryland was ruled for a time by martial law. He issued the Emancipation Proclamation, for which he's very famous, but the Emancipation Proclamation was an executive order that did not free the slaves. What it did was it freed the slaves in the states in rebellion. That is the Confederate States. It was a military necessity. It required the 13th Amendment to be passed for slavery to actually end in the United States. Theodore Roosevelt, who actually worked to establish the National Park Act, actually effectively set aside a lot of other lands by declaring them national monuments. And any president can do that. And as we know now, you know, the current administration has been looking at backtracking on national monuments. But Theodore Roosevelt expanded the executive office of the president in that way and other ways as well. Franklin Roosevelt, as we know, greatly expanded the office of the president. For the first time, really, the government was injected into the economy in big ways under Roosevelt. Truman issued an executive order